Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and hello, and thank you for having me. I wanted to begin by acknowledging again that I have the great privilege to live and work on Treaty 6 land, which is the traditional home of a number of Indigenous communities, including the Cree and the Blackfoot and the Métis, and a number of other communities that I'm still working on learning about. And I think of this work, in addition to learning and growing and understanding Indigenous traditions and Indigenous land, but this work of building communities that have a greater understanding of one another and better holistic models of care and of community care as a way to uphold my part in treaty, and to continue to work towards reconciliation. And so I hope that what I say today can be my small contribution to that. So there are two parts of my talk today, which I'm hoping will give us food for thought. The first will address the topic actually of the session. So the current context, digital life, the idea of resilience. And in the second half, I'll more specifically address mental health, which was a topic related to what was originally proposed and an area that the organizers were hoping that we could also discuss today. So like so many of us during these times, the landscape of my life has changed dramatically over the last few months. With the pandemic raging on outside, I have been one of those lucky people that's been able to retreat inwards. So my kids have been home since March. All of my teaching and psychotherapy has moved online. And in many ways, that's been a blessing. As an introvert, I still relish the opportunity to do events like this one from the comfort of my own home, to be able to have my kids close at hand, to be able to provide care for even more people as everyone gets more comfortable online, and to still be able to keep in touch with those that I love despite the distance between us. And yet, at the same time, it has been incredibly challenging. As much as technology has supported us in some really incredible ways, not all of us have the same access to it. And even for those of us that do, it certainly hasn't been without challenges. As His Highness the Aga Khan, the present Ismaili Imam, noted in a lecture at Brown University back in 2014, in the final analysis, the key to human cooperation and concord has not depended on advances in technologies of communication, but rather on how human beings go about using or abusing their technological tools. And over the past few months, we've seen yet again how true that quote actually is. While technology has become a primary vehicle of connection for many of us, it's also become an increasing source of anxiety and alienation and disillusionment. We've seen a rise in misinformation and hatred. And as more and more of us live and engage in these echo chambers, where we only hear opinions and perspectives that are similar to ours, we are comparing ourselves to others in ways that are increasingly unrealistic, and we're finding ourselves discontented with our lives. And then there is this very real truth that living online means being connected not just with the good things, birthdays and celebrations and moments of joy, but also the hardship and the grief. And now, perhaps more than ever, it means seeing those things not just for those to whom we are closest, but for hundreds and thousands and maybe even millions of us. Suddenly, every burden, every injustice, every inequity is immediately before us. And it's that last phenomenon that I wanted to speak to for this first half of my remarks, because it, probably more than anything in the past few months, has gotten me thinking about the potentials for resilience in this digital world that we face. As I have been watching inequality play out on a mass scale with not just the pandemic, but politics and power in so many other spheres, there is one line of the Quran that keeps coming back to me. Allah says that God does not burden a soul beyond God does not burden any soul with more than it can bear. And that comes to us from the second surah of the Quran, ayat 286. Now, to be honest, I have never been especially fond of this particular ayat. As a psychotherapist who sits with young Muslim women that have been through incredible traumas, and as someone who has herself had depression for a couple decades now, it has never really sat well with me. Part of that is because my perspective on the world is deeply shaped by the reality that far too often certain people, certain groups, bear a disproportionate burden. But especially now, when more than ever before, every piece of human hardship has been bared for us, has been on display in ways that are almost too real and too visceral for us to manage, it has been incredibly challenging. And maybe it's a good thing because it forces us to confront truths that we might otherwise have avoided. But it's also really hard because these are truths that are difficult to face. In the face of those truths, it's become increasingly hard for me to understand when Allah says that we are not burdened beyond what we can bear. Every day in my practice and in my life online, I see how much trauma some of us have to carry, how much more some of us have to bear. And I know how much this crisis has impacted my own life and my own mental health, and I'm relatively privileged and insulated. And that reality has made every single utterance of this verse chafe my heart and wound my spirit. But I also fundamentally, at the core of my being, believe that Allah is truth and that the guidance that we are given makes sense, even if it's not immediately clear to us. How then do we understand what it means to bear so much and still not have it be more than we can take? The third Aga Khan, the 48th Ismaili Imam, Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah, has a quote that I find myself turning back to when trying to work through questions like this. He says, "Struggle is the meaning of life. Defeat and victory is in the hands of God, but struggle itself is man's duty and it should be his joy." This is another quote that I have always found difficult to understand, but it has become clearer for me of late. For me, both the Quranic verse and this quote are speaking about resilience. And by resilience, I don't mean this materialistic bounce back to productivity that's become so normalized in our contemporary world, a resilience that positions human life as only meaningful when it contributes to the creation of capital. Instead, what I mean is resilience in a deep spiritual sense, a resilience at the core of our being, a resilience that we build through engagement with and struggle through the challenges of this world. To me, this kind of resilience is reflective of Sufi philosophies about the nature and meaning of suffering, like Rumi, who tells us, if you are irritated by every rub, how will you ever be polished? And so perhaps that's what having all these hardships in our face all the time is meant to do. Maybe they are the rubs that force us to become polished, to become clearer reflections of Allah's love and grace. We can consider the Quranic verse in that same light as well. Perhaps it's a way to shift our perspective, a way to give us hope. Hope that often we lose in the face of all of these rubs, all the intractable systems and the seemingly chaotic and uncontrollable nature of our world. It's a reminder that Allah sees and knows all of it, all of the injustice, all of the burdens that we carry, and promises that ultimate justice will come. It's a reminder that the resilience that we build is not just about survival, but about progress and about faith. This gives us a way to understand and cope with suffering, a way to make sense of what is happening to us. And if we continue on through the verse, that is what it indicates to me. It says, God does not burden any soul with more than it can bear. Each gains whatever good it has done and suffers its bad. This verse for me is a promise of justice, that a soul is not burdened beyond what it can bear. For me, that means that we have to think of the soul, the burden of the soul, of the balance of what we carry, not in linear human terms, not in human time, but on the scale of the divine. So while the human world might subject us to systems that impact us in extremely unfair and unequal ways, Allah promises us here and elsewhere that justice works at levels beyond that. On Yom Din, on the end of times and the day of judgment, when we have to account for ourselves and our actions, we will only be judged on our own good and our own mistakes. And I truly believe that if we as human beings can recognize the impact of the systems that we live in and how those have impacted our choices, that we can respond with compassion and understanding, can find pathways to justice that are equitable and restorative, then Allah, whose rahmah is all-encompassing, would be a source of justice so true and so real that ours would pale in comparison. I want to be clear, though, that this is not meant to be spiritual bypassing or a way to alleviate our responsibility in this world. Because really the way in which we're disproportionately impacted by situations like this pandemic, that's a human failing. It tells us that we as human beings are not caring for one another. When an earthquake in Kashmir kills thousands, but the same magnitude earthquake in California kills no one, that's not an act of God. That's a statement about infrastructure and access and wealth. And the same is true of this pandemic. It tells us very clearly that far too often we are not striving for equity and justice for one another, that we forget one another, especially when we are the ones that have more. The burden that we carry as a result of those choices is not an act of God in the strict sense, but an act of humanity. And we have to be responsible for that, because those choices too will burden our souls and be accounted for in the ultimate balance. But essentially, what this current moment has been for me is an invitation for us to consider what resilience looks like when we move it outside the realm of the material and the mundane. It asks us to consider how we hold one another and care for one another while still working towards creating meaning and hope that goes beyond just this moment. We have been asked deep existential questions, and it's up to us to rise to the occasion and to answer them. I'll stop here for now and pick up in the next set of remarks, where I'm hoping to consider the ways in which we engage and understand with mental health, because I do believe that that's one of the ways in which we can answer those questions and ensure that we are doing everything that we can to alleviate these undue burdens on as many people as we can, so that the resilience we build is spiritual and meaningful rather than just a survival mechanism in the face of trauma. Thank you.